Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's fun to be back to saying my original intro. As many times as I've said the other intros about walking around, the original discussion of stepping off the train is still my favorite, and I'm back to it. Today was my first day back on campus for the fall semester. It was an interesting day of meetings with academic officers. Sometimes a little on the dry side, but full of useful and necessary information about the state of my college. It's exciting to be doing the podcast in the afternoon again, and I actually had what I think is a good topic to discuss. So this is inspired by a couple things. I guess I'll start first with the thing that led me most to write this, which is both the podcasts Blue Peg and Pink Peg and the Brawling Brothers, or the Your Brawling Brothers, covered a new game coming out from Plaid Hat that sounds really exciting. It's the next Crossroads game, and it's called Gen 7. If you haven't heard about it, I will tell you a little bit about it later, but I wanted to say that the coverage of that game, as discussed on both of those podcasts, is the key thing that led me to my discussion today. And what I wanted to discuss, we'll see how hard I'm foreshadowing this, is the idea of multiple discovery. Multiple discovery is a concept from the field of invention and science generally that talks about the notion that a new idea or a new way of doing something is usually not obvious, but is usually part of the zeitgeist of a particular community or a particular time. And while we do credit individual people for inventing individual things, often the difference between one person getting credit and another is a matter of years, days, months, weeks, even minutes. In particular, three that stand out in history, cases of multiple discovery in the 17th century: Isaac Newton and Leibniz, Leibniz, I think, both simultaneously and in separate countries discovered calculus. Newton did a better job of popularizing this advanced form of mathematics, so Newton is generally recognized as having discovered it, but so is Leibniz. They were far apart and discovered it independently. Similarly, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace both basically discovered evolution at the same time, or articulated it at the same time. And finally, perhaps most famously, Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray not only both invented the telephone around the same time, they filed for telephone patents on the same day. Alexander Graham Bell's patent went in a couple hours earlier than Elisha Gray's, and so Alexander Graham Bell goes down in history as the person who invented the telephone. The point of this is to suggest that human beings are both a complex and creative species, but also that we approach problems in similar ways, and often we find solutions to problems in similar ways. In the game playing world, I've certainly seen that, where I'll come up with an idea for a deck in Netrunner, and then discover that someone else is already using that same deck idea somewhere else. The old canard, there's nothing new under the sun, seems to apply. In creative fields, this kind of parallel evolution is remarkably similar. There's a phenomenon called twin films, where big Hollywood studios will produce two films of similar theme or idea and release them within a year of each other or so. There's actually a huge Wikipedia article about twin films. The two that I remember from first noticing this sort of thing happening were Dante's Peak and Volcano, both stories about disastrous volcanoes that came out, but also Deep Impact and Armageddon. Famously, the movie Deep Impact, which is about a meteor hitting the Earth, or an asteroid hitting the Earth, and Armageddon, which is about an asteroid hitting the Earth. Famously, Deep Impact included the phrase, "This will not be Armageddon," given by one of the president, played by Morgan Freeman, in the movie. I guess they had to cut that because test audiences were snickering because they'd already heard about Armageddon. So this is not to say that there's not something interesting to be found in these parallels, but rather to call to attention the fact of parallel creativity. Within the field of board games, this is something we see all too often. It's not at all uncommon for games with similar themes to come out, or for games that draw on like cultural experiences to come out. It's not hard to look at Zombicide and look at Last Night on Earth and say, hey, these are very similar games. Now, Zombicide was made in light of Last Night on Earth, so it's not quite the same. But we certainly do see games of similar ideas coming out around the same time, such that we start to talk about trends. One or two popular roll and writes came out a couple years ago, and now the market is flooded with them. For example, when you're a game developer, this part can be even more frustrating, which brings me back to Brocard's Unicorn. So when I first started developing games in 2015 with my pal Rob, we spent a lot of time working on not only our first game that we co-published, Cromlech, but also a number of other games, a couple of which we hope to bring to market within the next year, but several other designs which we've kind of tinkered with, and they've been sitting in various states of development. One of the games that we have been working on is a game of sort of competitive cooperation about a starship that is a generation ship being flown to a far-off planet. And the people who are currently alive are so far removed from the early generations of the ship that they don't really remember the reason they're going on this journey to begin with, or don't have the same fervor that the original settlers did when they built and launched the ship. But the idea is that the settlers have to work together to manage resources and repair the ship, which is slowly getting damaged round by round. We called this game Brocard's Unicorn, and it's been in various stages of vaporware for a while now, but we have significant development done on it. So it was a little disappointing to learn that the new Crossroads game from Plaid Hat Games, Generation 7, is about a generation ship in which the 7th generation of people on board are having trouble keeping the ship in good repair. The different players will be in charge of different resources, and they'll have to work together to repair and progress the ship. Now, listening to the reviews of the game, it sounds like there's lots of other interesting things going on. But from the back of the envelope sketch of what the game is, it's hard not to feel a little defeated in that this game we've been working on for so long suddenly feels like, oh, someone else brought that same thing to market. Now, as somebody who watches the design forums over at Board Game Design Lab, where I did for a while, and the design forums on Kickstarter and on BoardGameGeek, this is a common phenomenon. The idea that you have a concept for a game, and then you look and that game seems to already exist. There's been a really compelling thread on BoardGameGeek recently, started by a relatively new user who showed up to talk about their excitement in the game they were making. And then they posted a thread called "I Feel Like I've Been Punched in the Gut," in which they talked about that they just discovered a game that came out 2 years ago that has an almost identical theme and what sounds like very similar gameplay to the game they've been working on. Of course, once they described the game they've been working on, then people said, oh, have you looked at this game and this game and this game? And they sort of talked about like several other games that have similar gameplay mechanisms and similar theme. Now, I don't know about the designer, but I know to me it actually opens up the space to have several games fit that theme, because then it doesn't feel like you're the only one following suit. Like if there were only one zombie game and you made the second zombie game, it'd feel a lot worse than if you're making the 10th. Nonetheless, the conversations around that person sort of suggested, one, this theme isn't really that original to begin with, which isn't that encouraging. But the other discussion was more along the lines of, yeah, that happens to everybody, and you can either decide that they did the thing you were trying to do, drop that design and move on to another, or you can continue working on your game, content in the knowledge that your design will inherently be different than theirs. Everybody who makes a game has the potential of finding that their game is just like another game that's already out there. But with each game designer, a new arrangement of pieces and mechanisms and text and ideas gets born, and the game reaches a new level of innovation. As long as you're making effort to not directly copy what those other games are doing, most of the time you'll find that you drift far enough apart from what they're doing that you can find your own way. So that leads me back to my conundrum, and that the conundrum of Brocard's Unicorn. Now I will say right now we haven't really been working on that game that far. If you line up all the games we've been working on and say how close is that one to publishing, not close. So sort of setting it aside at this point and trying to think about what other themes might fit, or waiting till Gen 7 comes out and seeing how close our game is to that one. These are both quite viable options, as we're not anywhere near finishing Brocard's Unicorn. We have other games that are closer to development and thus earn a higher spot on our priority list. But I'm curious, for those of you who've listened, where do you find yourself in this creative vacuum? How do you maintain your creative energy when you discover the thing you've been working on, or one of the things you've been working on, already exists, or already exists better than you could do it? And this is the eternal question faced by the creative writer, right? I guess by the game designer as well. Yes, the game that I want to be amazing. But if I decide the game that I'm making isn't as good as my favorite games, should I still release it? It's a challenge. I think novels work the same way. If I write a story and I think it's pretty good, do I still release it even if I know it's not as good as many other novels I've read? Perhaps. I mean, one of the advantages to something like Kickstarter, or publishing through a publishing house, for that matter, is that you get the judgment of other people to help determine whether or not your thing is worth doing. So for your listeners out there, I'm curious, when have you faced this kind of creative duplication? Have you seen yourself get copied before you had a chance to tell the world about your thing? If so, what did you do? Did you keep working on it? Did you give it up and move on to something better? Content with the idea that, yeah, that theme's been done now I don't have to do it. Or something else in between. I'd be interested to hear. Pop over to BoardGameGeek Guild 3269 and let me know what you think and what you have done in the past when your creative ideas turn out to already exist or get mimicked in the same way. One last anecdote I wanted to tell. Gil Hova posted some really interesting conversation once about a game he was working on. For a while, Gil Hova was working on a television show, a game about television networks that he called Prime Time. Late in the development, he discovered that there was another company also working on a game about television networks, also calling their game Prime Time, and slated to hit the market or the Kickstarter about a month before his. This could be devastating, but Gil Hova decided to continue on. He changed the name of his game. He looked at their game and looked at his and saw that they were different enough that both games could coexist. And lo and behold, both games went to Kickstarter, were successfully funded, and were distributed. Now, Gil Hova's game, perhaps because it was better, perhaps because it was created by Gil Hova, who already had a reputation, or perhaps through some other set of circumstances, did much better in the overall marketplace than Primetime did. Last I saw, Primetime was available on clearance and nowhere else. Gil Hova just did a reprint of the networks along with a very successful expansion, which I'm waiting to receive in the mail right now, Mr. Hova. So, that's a lesson for those of you considering abandoning your project. One last thought. I am looking at a new feature for the podcast, something to do on perhaps a monthly basis, depending how much response we get, and that's a question and answer session. So if you're interested in asking a question that I could answer on the podcast, pop over to BoardGameGeek Guild and post the question in the thread that I've made for that purpose, or pop me an email, brendan@rattleboxgames.com, to post your question. That's about it for me today. Thanks for joining me. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye. Similarly, Darwin and Alfred.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.